Welcome to Madlik. My name is Geoffrey Stern, and at Madlik we light a spark or shed some light on a Jewish text or tradition. Along with Rabbi Adam Mintz, we host Madlik Disruptive Torah on Clubhouse every Thursday at 8 p.m. Eastern and share it as the Madlik podcast on your favorite podcast platform. Today, the gods of folly are shining on us as Purim coincides with St. Patrick's Day. So grab a drink as we explore Purim, St. Patrick's Day, Mardi Gras, and more. So welcome and l'chaim to you all. Thank you so much for joining us today. So Rabbi, are you struck as I am that here we have Purim, the same day as St. Patrick's Day, and, Mardi Gras, which is, I guess, before Easter, which is like Lent, and is also a kind of crazy holiday. And then I'm in LA where there are a lot of Persians, and it's also Nowruz.
Why don't you tell me about
So all of these holidays. So as far as I understand, Nowruz is also a New Year's type. It has one interesting facet to it. I mean, it's a feast, a major feast. And I guess the Persians are like the Jews in that regard. What's the point of celebrating if it doesn't include food? But it also includes an interesting aspect, which is shaking of the house, where in some communities they actually take all the furniture out. They definitely shake the carpets. So there's an element in many of these holidays of both folly and maybe a little bit of alcohol and frivolry, as well as a little bit of spring cleaning. Some refer to the beginning of Lent as there's something called Clean Sunday. So they all seem, and they all obviously coincide with spring. So is this a coincidence, or do you, like me, think that there's some tzad hashava, something that connects them all?
There has to be something that connects them. It's just like we've spoken in the past about the fact that in winter, everybody has a holiday of lights, whether it's Hanukkah or Christmas or Kwanzaa, everybody has a holiday. And we understand that because it's when the days are short and it's cold and it's dark, you need a holiday of lights. There must be something about the beginning of the spring that requires us to let go and to start anew. There must be something there that connects all these holidays. And I look forward to exploring that with you tonight.
Absolutely. Now, I think the easy one for us, because Christianity is so related to Judaism, is that certainly Lent, I understand the word comes from long, which is the days are getting longer. We just changed the clock for that very reason. And there's no question that we all know that Lent is a time where Christians are more observant, where Christians take upon themselves certain stringencies. And I think the most obvious connection between Mardi Gras and Festival in Brazil and Lent is that there's sort of a release before you begin tshuva. I mentioned last week, St. Anselm said, Lord, make me chaste, but not quite yet. And there's a little bit of that working here, where you go ahead and get wild and release, and then you get very serious. And I'm wondering, you spoke last Shabbat, I believe, in your synagogue, between the connection between Purim and Pesach. And I know that we're supposed to start studying about Pesach right after Purim ends. Did you touch upon what was the connection between Purim and Pesach that you talked about?
So what I talked about was the fact that Purim and Pesach both represent redemptions. Purim is one kind of redemption, and Pesach, Purim was the redemption of the Jews from Persia, and Pesach is a different kind of redemption, the redemption of the Jews from Egypt. But we put the two holidays next to one another, and the explanation that I talked about last week was the following. that this year is a leap year. The leap year means that there are 2 Adars this year. And because there are 2 Adars this year, the question is when to celebrate Purim. Should we celebrate Purim in the first Adar or the second Adar? And the Talmud says that we celebrate Purim in the second Adar so that we can connect the 2 redemptions to one another. So there's no question that they're connected. And another interesting thing, that already, Purim has been over here in New York for about an hour. And already there's talk that you have to start preparing for Pesach. The Talmud says that 30 days before Pesach, you have to start studying the laws of Pesach. Maybe by talking about that law, we fulfill that obligation. And therefore, tonight is 30 days before Pesach. Actually, 4 weeks from tomorrow night will be the first Seder. It's hard to imagine, but 4 weeks from tomorrow night will be the first Seder. In addition, some people have the tradition that they do not eat matzah between Purim and Pesach. The Mintz family has that tradition. We're done with matzah. Until Pesach, we are done with matzah. We will not have matzah. And the reason is that kind of gets us excited about Pesach. When we sit down and have matzah at the first Seder, it's something we haven't had in a month. And, there definitely is a connection. There's somehow Purim builds up to Pesach somehow.
Do you think at all that drinking all of our scotch and beer we're getting rid of the Hametz already 30 days before?
I don't think so, but I think that your question is a good question. And that is, why is it that we drink on Purim? I think that is an interesting question. And you said that the Persian holiday also drinks. So where does the drinking come from?
So the Persian holiday is, like I said, Nowruz, and they have something called Kuhne Tekuni, which means literally shaking the house. And that's part of their cleaning thing. I don't know whether they drink. Obviously, today, so many Persians are Muslim that they probably don't drink, but Nowruz is a pre-Muslim holiday. It's really going back, which is kind of fascinating. If again, I reset the room, and we're talking about basically holidays that come from Persia before Islam. We're talking about Christianity that came out of Judaism, and then obviously Judaism. And they all have these 2 different themes. One is some sort of release, it seems, frivolity, folly, before you get very serious. And the other one is cleaning. Because we know of Western Christianity, we know about Ash Wednesday. But as I said before, there is this Clean Monday, and part of the Clean Monday in the Eastern Church literally has to do with doing tshuva, they read the same Psalms that we do before we do Rosh Hashanah. There is definitely a buildup to the climax of redemption, which we share. That is Pesach. And you pointed out that there is this inextricable connection between Purim and Pesach. I mean, this year, you could make the case that had we not had an Ibur Shana, a Shama Muberet, a leap year, I would be talking to you right now at the Seder. This would be the Seder. And so I think that, there's something about Purim. One of the beautiful midrashim or words that people say about Purim is that Yom Kippur is a Yom Kippurim, that Yom Kippur is like Purim, and Yom Kippur clearly is the most serious holiday of the year, and Purim is probably the most frivolous. And there's no question that one of the things that we need to talk about tonight is the connection between the two, that these are the two extremes, and are the two extremes connected at all? Are there pathways for some people to find God and spirituality and redemption through the very serious introspection, and for others from pure undulated joy? I think that's another wonderful question that we can discuss.
That is a very good question to discuss. Yes.
So the fascinating thing is that one of the connections that we have is that on Pesach there are very stringent laws about what you can't have. And I said a second ago that is there a connection between drinking the liquor, which is basically Hametz because it is wine or grapes or grain that has fermented, which ultimately is what Hametz is, and what you're not allowed to do on Pesach. And so, really at Madlik, we discuss the Parsha every week. And in this week's Parsha, we have a fascinating insight into things that we normally associate only with Passover, and that is leavened and unleavened bread. So if you look at Leviticus 6 and 7, it starts going through the different sacrifices. And what I love about the different sacrifices, and I've talked about this before, I think that in our synagogue services, we need to modify our synagogue services so that there are, just like there's mincha service, which is the afternoon service, but which is actually modeled after a particular sacrifice called the mincha sacrifice. There have to be services for different people at different times, feeling different emotions and having different spiritual needs. But in any case, we go through the different sacrifices that are brought, and we will see in a second that some of them have no unleavened bread, and some of them have a mixture of leavened and unleavened, and some of them emphasize the leaven. So it's, again, a kind of variation on the theme that I think we're talking about, which of these opposites. There's a place for the opposites. So in Leviticus 6, the first sacrifice that it talks about, and you can almost read these as recipes, is the Todat mincha, the meal offering. And again, we have a service that we do every afternoon that is modeled after that. And it says in verse 9, it shall be eaten as unleavened cakes in the sacred precept. They shall eat it in the enclosure of the tent of meeting. It shall not be baked with leaven. So those of us who believe that the whole symbiology of leaven has to do with the Jews leaving Egypt and not having time to bake their bread have to take a step back here, because obviously we're being exposed to a grammar, to a vocabulary that says certain things about a sacrifice when it says, and this one you can't use leaven, as opposed to the sacrifice of well-being, the zevach hashlamim, and that is made of unleavened cakes with oil, unleavened wafers spread with oil, and cakes of choice flours, the offering with cakes of leavened bread. So here, all of a sudden, in this other sacrifice, we have a mixture of leavened and unleavened. And there's a wonderful commentary that kind of drills down into this and says, well, this is Zevach Torat Shlamav. It's about your peace. It's about your wholeness and thanks, and it has to have the leavened bread. And it's fascinating that he says that you have to eat it very quickly, which causes you to invite more people. So many of these sacrifices had to be eaten. We always think of a sacrifice as something that gets burnt and destroyed, but most of the sacrifice, at least many of them, had to be like the the Passover sacrifice, they had to be eaten with a bunch of people. And so the one commentary, which is the Emek Davar, which I have in the source sheet, I didn't have a chance to translate it, but it talks about, number one, if you're celebrating, you have to have leavened bread. And two, that you have a time constraint which requires you to share your joy with other people. So I think the takeaway from all of this is that there is a much more universal vocabulary of what leavened means and what unleavened bread means. And we have to kind of enlarge our universe of discourse when we discuss these things. And it will help us on Passover, but it will also help us the rest of the year. What does leavened and unleavened mean to you, Rabbi?
So, this is all, you gave a great introduction. Thank you, Geoffrey. And obviously, this is relevant 30 days before Passover. Generally speaking, the rabbis understand leaven as a sign of wealth. Now, that comes from the Pesach story, that matzah is called the bread of affliction, the bread of poverty, right? Poor people can't afford a whole piece of bread. So that's why we break the matzah. You know, at the Seder, just looking forward to the Seder, we make the afikoman. How do we make the afikoman? We break the middle matzah in half, right? That's the tradition. Everybody breaks the middle matzah in half. One of the reasons you break the middle matzah in half is because matzah is the bread of poverty. Leaven, bread that rises, is considered to be a sign of wealth. Generally speaking, the rabbis explain the Torah. There are only two sacrifices that have leavened bread. The Todah, the sacrifice of thanksgiving, and on Shavuot, on Pentecost, the Shtei Halechem, the sacrifice that represents the new crop. Those are the only two sacrifices the whole year that have leavened bread. And the way they explain it is as follows. Generally speaking, sacrifices are our sign of humility as we stand before God. But two times we don't want to be humble. When we give thanksgiving to God, we want to throw everything to God. We want to give him the best, right? Because we're so thankful. We want to give him even leavened bread. And the same thing with the sacrifice of the two breads, the Shtei Halechem, that's a celebration. And when we celebrate, then we want to do the best we can do. We want to kind of show off our wealth and our success. So actually, the idea of leaven and unleavened is very much connected to Pesach. The idea of leaven being something, wealth and prosperity, and unleavened as something as poverty. But I think the key jump here is, and this is a very important jump, and that is unleavened also means humility. And that, Passover is supposed to be a holiday of humility. They explain, the Hasidic rabbis explain, that Mitzrayim, that's Egypt, is actually, could also be pronounced Mitzarim, which means tight places. Mitzrayim was tight places. It was a place where it was hard to get around, right? The Jews didn't have flexibility. They were slaves. They were in tight places. And only when they left were they able kind of to exhale. So the experience of slavery was an experience of poverty, of difficulty, of unleavened bread.
I love the Hebrew. Mitzrayim is like Meitzar, which is a narrow place. All of us know the Yiddish or anglicized version of tzarot. Tzoros, gehackte tzoros. It comes from the same word tsar, which is narrow. And then you talked about the bread. The Hametz is always associated with wealth. But the Hebrew word for wealth is ashir. And ashrenu also comes from that. There's not always a negative connotation to being rich, because richness can be in material goods, but it can also be ashrei yoshvei veitecha, those of us who are complete and whole and rich in spiritual things.
And that's the idea of gratitude, that when we express gratitude, we want to be complete and rich and wealthy and give it all we got, I think is what we would say in English.
You know what's amazing to me? The part of the Haggadah called Magid has only one requirement, and it says that you, in the Mishnah, that you have to say the verses that are said when you bring the Bikurim, those loaves of the first grain, which is amazing if you think of it. Here you are at a meal that you are eating only matzah and not Hametz, and you're quoting, the part that begins with "My forefather was a wandering Aramean." That is what somebody says. Correct me if I'm wrong. When they raise up those the elevation offering, the 2 loaves of bread to thank God. Is that also a little bit of this duality here?
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's a tension. I would say a balance, but I think the better word is a tension. And I think that's really interesting, that there's a tension between the idea of humility and the idea of gratitude, with all that we have.
So, the word that is chametz, now that we've kind of pulled it away from the Passover Exodus story, and we talk in terms of it's kind of a universal, at least as far as the ancient Near East. It meant something. Hametz meant something, and lechem meant something. And I'd like to look at that for a second. The word hametz can mean sour. It can mean, and the reason, vinegar in modern day Hebrew is chamutz. It's right. When something ferments. It also can mean something that has gone bad. It's deteriorated. It's gotten stale, so to speak. And I think one of the aspects of that unites all of the responses to the spring is to kind of wipe away that which has kind of deteriorated over the winter and look at the new crop and the new sproutings, and spring has come. And I think there's a level of that as well here. Hametz has a sense of, in the New Testament, they criticized the Jews for being a chametz. It has this element of, and they took that right from our tradition, because in our tradition, the chametz obviously needs heat, which translates into passion to rise. It's been associated with redness, with the passion of anger and stuff like that. It's been associated, on the one hand, we've seen with ashirut, which can be both richness in a bad sense, but clearly richness also in a wonderful sense. But then also this aspect of the evil inclination and the passion of the moment, and then the deterioration, and you want to wipe off the old and bring in the new.
Yeah, there's no question that that's right. And I think that's a tension that plays itself out in so many different areas. But sacrifices is one of those areas. And the holiday of Pesach is another one of those areas. On one hand, matzah is the bread of affliction. At the same time, matzah is the bread of freedom. How can it be that the matzah of affliction is also the matzah of freedom? The answer is that's what we always have a tension between. How do we look at things? Do we see things as our opportunity for leaven, for opportunity, for all of these things, or do we say no, that we need to be humble? And I think the answer is that, of course, both are true.
And of course, bread, takes us back to the sin of eating the apple. In Genesis 3, Adam is punished, and it says, "By the sweat of your brow shall you get bread to eat until you return to the ground." every time we make a blessing over a challah, we say Hamotzi lechem min haaretz, and we are clearly making reference to this verse and this. And again, it's a question: is this a curse? Is it a curse to work? Or is it the reality and the joy of being human? Because, I'll never forget when the peace treaty was made between Begin and Sadat. The verse that Menachem Begin quoted was Hazorim b'dima barina yiktsaru. He who sows in tears will reap in pain. There's a part of our tradition that puts down labor, and there's a part of our tradition, as we visited in recent episodes, that celebrates labor. And here too, there's this sense of struggle. We cannot but admit the connection between lechem and milchama and war, the struggle of life, the struggle between crazy people like Putin who want more bread, who have a desire for more, who need to have that struggle. It's all in here. Is there a connection between milchama and lechem?
I never thought of it, but maybe there is. Maybe that's what we fight for. And, maybe that's part of the challenge. Milchama, lacham, the word lacham and the word lechem. I mean, there's no question the word lacham and the word lechem is the same word. I wonder what the connection is between the two. That's very interesting.
So the connection that I made, I haven't seen that much. It seems clear to me. The connection that I think you find in the text of the Bible is the opposite. In other words, I go from war and conflict to lechem, which is the staple of life. And that at the end of the day, it's the fighting over territory, over turf. But the Bible goes the opposite direction. So in Numbers, when it talks about the spies coming back from seeing the land of Canaan, it says, Ki lachmenuhem, they will devour us, they will eat us like bread. And they say, Eretz ochelet yoshveha, it's a land that eats its settlers. But there's no question that there is a connection between the struggle to eke out a living and to provide, and the struggle of limited resources and war and conflict.
There is no question that that's right. I mean, and that you see that so strongly in what's going on in Ukraine. What are we fighting about? Are we fighting lacham about lechem? Is ultimately all war about bread, about success, about being prosperous? Is that what war is about? Is lacham and lechem the same thing, or lacham and lechem opposite things?
So, I think at the end of the day, this conversation of lechem, of bread, and matzah and unleavened bread, and both of them have connotations that are it's very opposite. As you mentioned, matzah can be both the lechem oni, it can be the bread of the poor person, but it can also be the bread of the person who doesn't need those riches, who's pure and doesn't require the passion, has that mindset of serenity. And the same goes for the bread. It can be richness and material, but it can also be the ashrei yoshvei, the pure wealth of prosperity, and it can be this joy that people have when they bring the first fruits and they thank God for it. And I think this confluence that we see here in the sacrifices, but also in these traditions, traditions that we see, this connection between Purim and Passover. And I think there's a kind of, there's a line between the two, and we all have to find our spot on that line or spots on that line. It makes it so fascinating, this wonderful month that we are entering now, where we make this transition from the giddiness of drinking to excess, and then sitting down at the Seder. And redemption is somewhere in there. It's to me, I love Purim. I have to say it's one of my favorite holidays. I've been at Purim meals where people have gotten drunk. Fathers have talked to their children, their grown children, and just kind of shared their soul with them as one would never hear. And it's a beautiful holiday, and it's a surprise that it is related.
That's a good word for Purim. Purim is a surprise, right? You never know what to expect on Purim. Every holiday, you know what to expect. You know what Yom Kippur is going to bring. You know how you're going to feel. You know what the davening is like. You know what shul is like. It's very much the expected. Purim's always a surprise. That's a very smart idea, I think.
A pleasant surprise, and it can be a troubling surprise.
It could be a bad surprise, but it's a surprise, right? You never know. And I think you need to build surprises in. I wonder whether that's what the drinking, what the frivolity, I wonder whether that's part of it, the idea of having a surprise.
Well, certainly one of the themes of Purim is v'nahapachu, which means to turn things on their head. We know you're supposed to get drunk, so you don't know the difference between cursed be Haman and blessed be Mordechai. But I think our little exploration today that tied into both the holidays that are celebrated by many different peoples on this day and the Parsha that we're reading certainly shared that with us. There's this delight that we can have, this open tent that welcomes everybody no matter what path they come from, whether it's joy or sadness. There's a message for all of you, and that's kind of also the message of the Parsha. As you read it this Shabbat, there's a sacrifice for everybody, and I think again I've been preaching that these aren't so much sacrifices as ways of relating and ways of expressing different emotions at different moments.
I think that's beautiful. I want to wish everybody again a happy Purim for those people who still have Purim, a Shabbat Shalom. It's a confluence of Shabbat and Purim and all the good things. Right after Purim comes Shushan Purim. In Jerusalem, they're actually just beginning their celebration of Purim now. They celebrate the day afterward, the 15th day of Adar. So Shabbat Shalom. We look forward to next week as we continue our travels through the book of Vayikra, through the book of Leviticus. Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom, Chag Purim Sameach to you all. We'll see you all next week.